Hello, everyone. John, can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Perfect. Well, hello, and thank you, everyone, for tuning into this Ivy webinar today. My name is Tara, and I work with Ivy, which is a business and project management platform and community for home professionals. Ivy allows pros to centralize their billing, their sourcing, purchasing, and administrative tasks all in one place, including being able to generate customized documents, room boards, managing client communication, invoicing and collecting online payments, tracking project calendars, and more. And pros using Ivy also have access to use our mobile app, which allows you to manage your projects and tasks on the go. Together with various industry experts, Ivy hosts educational webinars with industry professionals to explore the different ways that you can manage your business more efficiently. So today I'm very excited to welcome back to the Ivy webinar stage my good friend, John Dupra. Welcome back, John.
Thank you. Good to be back.
Great. And you've been in the wood flooring business your entire life. He's actually working for his family business, Revel Woods, which for those of you who don't know, Revel Woods is a company that supplies expert curated and craft flooring online. So John knows everything there is to know about wood and has held several leadership positions within the National Wood Flooring Association, and has also been featured in a number of publications, including being recognized in Hardwood Floors magazine's first ever 40 Under 40. So today, John will discuss what to look for when sourcing hardwood flooring for client projects, including species, finishes, textures, and widths. And he'll provide a visual history of wood flooring and touch on how the cut of the wood affects the grain, visual, aesthetic, and technical advantages and disadvantages of different sizing. And he'll also touch on what to look for when sourcing a floor for highly active spaces. So just a little bit of housekeeping for the next 45 minutes. John will run through his presentation, and then we'll leave 15 minutes at the end for all of your questions. So to submit a question, under the slides here, you can see a little tab under the Get Free Ivy Demo button. There's an Ask a Question text link there. You can click that to submit, and then we'll do our best to address all of your questions at the end of the webinar. So if you're having technical difficulties, you can chat in the live chat and I'll answer you there, but none of our questions for John will be addressed if they're submitted in the live chat. So thank you for your cooperation. And without further ado, I'm very excited to welcome John. John, thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, pitter patter, let's get at her. So a little bit about this. So the title is a little bit of a misnomer. It says everything you need to know about hardwood flooring. It is, in fact, everything you need to know. It's not going to be everything there is to know because that's a lot, but it's also shortened because it was originally everything you need to know about hardwood flooring is an element of design for fun and profit, but Ivy said that was too long. So without further ado, please proceed under your desk and tuck your head between your legs because I am about to drop some knowledge bombs. A little bit. That was a wonderful introduction. Thank you, Tara. A little bit about me. Number one, I guess I really like this picture because it's in every slide. Not really, but I started out in the wood flooring industry really when I was born. My father started as a contractor and he did that for about 23-ish or so years. So I kind of grew up around it, which I know makes everybody really jealous. Like, oh, you grew up in the wood flooring industry, you're lucky. So, but yeah, some people are just lucky. And so I kind of learned the business that way. My father started a wholesale distributorship up in Rochester, New York, where we are still actually, which I know, again, another point everyone's really jealous of because, Rochester is the real New York, not podunk Manhattan where Tara is. So I joined up with him in that business in wholesale, and the wood flooring industry is really, really old and kind of has a very old sort of supply chain. So before I joined him, I built a lot of contacts myself. My first job out of college was actually working for a materials manufacturing company selling the sandpaper that contractors use in hardwood flooring. So their third thing to be jealous of, I was in the sandpaper game. I can tell you walk into a bar and you tell people that you sell sandpaper and phone numbers just shower on you. So all false humility aside, so that was my experience. And then in there, when I started joining the family business, rejoined it, we realized that the industry is very old and runs on this very old kind of path. So we said, okay, what does the future look like? And realistically, it goes manufacturer to wholesale distributor to sort of a flooring store. And that's where the interior designers kind of came in at that flooring store point. And we thought, what if we built a tool that sort of made the interior designer the flooring store? And that's where we came up with Revel Woods. So a quick word about kind of who we are and why we did this, so that you understand that everything I'm telling you is kind of where we're coming from. We understood as experts, industry experts. Tara mentioned the National Wood Flooring Association. My father has been kind of working through that organization throughout his career. He is actually currently chairman of the National Wood Flooring Association. That is a title he got a month ago, and he will serve a 2-year term as chairman. So all this information we're giving you is through the National Wood Flooring Association, which is considered the basically international standard, because there's a lot of confusion out there in our industry, which I will talk about. So one of the things we did in trying to empower interior designers was we developed a proprietary algorithm that we call our project-based sourcing method. So not everything works in every situation. So we take, before we show you product, you create a space, and then we take into account all the factors that need to be taken into account, and then show you options that work for that specific project. And then based on top of that, we also sort of serve as a flooring coach and a flooring concierge. So if you're adding wood flooring to your business offering, working with us, we will kind of guide you through a lot of that and kind of be your sourcing partner. And we can also help with pairing you with the right installation partners and just making sure that you can be where we want to replace the traditional retail flooring store with the interior designer, so that you have everything you need in order to add that to your portfolio, increase your control over your job, and make some money in the process. So we really are the first to create a flooring sourcing platform with the interior designer as the focus. So that said, what we're going to do today is, this is going to be some technical stuff in here. This is sort of stuff that you don't need to memorize all of this in order to do this successfully. Like, it's good to know this is out there, retain some of it, keep it in the back of your head. And then if you're working with us, just know that these are the kinds of things that we take into account when we're sourcing something and when we're selling something. So we're going to go through some main components, so you kind of know, as if you're designing around wood floors, what you need to look for. So we'll talk about different species, the cut, which is more important than I think you're probably thinking, finishes, which you probably already know is important. And then I'm going to do color a little bit, but not much, just because as designers, which I am not, you're probably going to know more about it than me. So I don't want to like drag you down with stuff that you're going to be better than me at. So let's talk about wood as a building material. So wood is an organic material, right? Surprise, comes from trees. So because of that, though, it responds to its environment. It changes, it can change over time, depending on how it ages and its exposure to sunlight and things like that. And the performance of wood is going to be based on a lot of different conditions, such as the species or the structure, the climate, subfloor, the activity level, that kind of thing. And it's important to understand how those things, even at a rudimentary level, affect the performance and elements of design, so that both you and your client are having proper expectations. Because I think we all know what happens when they believe something's going to be amazing or something's going to work and it actually doesn't. So it's really good. I probably don't have to tell you this, but it's really good to cut that off before it becomes an issue. So first, let's talk about sustainability of wood as a building material. First, wood flooring, we've done several life cycle analysis of different building materials, and wood just crushes everything else. From how long it takes to actually grow and replace it, it'll serve its purpose as a floor longer than it takes to replace that wood. And it's one of the only products that do that. That's not true for carpet or any petroleum-based product. Stone they kind of cheat because it's stone. But the life cycle analysis on wood is that it's very environmentally friendly because it's designed to last. And that's why when we pick things for wood flooring, I always say we want to trend lightly, because you are picking something that's designed to be there for a very long time. And the good news with wood too is that the trends in wood are a lot longer than something like tile, where tile it'll still hold up, but it's just ugly after a few years. So you rip it out because it's ugly, but it's totally fine. Whereas wood still isn't going to be as ugly as quickly. So a quick word on the environmental aspect on how trees are harvested, so you understand where this is coming from. And what I'm talking about specifically pertains to the United States and Canada. When you're talking about harvesting trees and forests outside of the North American region, things can get a little dicey. And so I was talking to someone, his name is Professor Alex Wiedenhofer. He's a professor at the University of Wisconsin. And his whole thing was he helped develop the standards for FSC. And he's a wood forensic scientist, which is actually a thing. And yes, I'm sure it's boring, but he does have some pretty cool stories. So what he was telling me is that outside of the United States and Canada, the illegal timber trade is bigger both in volume and in dollar amount than drugs, which shocked me to hear that. But there's so much lumber laundering, for lack of a better term, that when you get outside of the US, things can get kind of sketchy and it's hard to track that. That's why FSC exists. Whether or not they do it is up for debate, but that is certainly their intent. So in the US and Canada, the way it works is you go through a section of forest and they don't just like clear cut it like the bad guy in Fern Gully. They mark a section like, okay, this section is going to be harvested this year. Someone goes through and marks all of the trees that are of a certain size and diameter. So anything that's smaller, doesn't fit that bill, doesn't get touched. Then they go through, harvest those trees. And then for every roughly cubic meter that's harvested, 1.6 cubic meters are planted. That number is a rough estimate, though. I don't want anybody coming back being like, oh, my second cousin Doodle worked for Forest Company and it was 1.42. So it's somewhere in that region. And then what that allows, though, is that the older trees, it lowers the canopy. So the younger trees get a chance to grow. They get access to sunlight and water and resources. And then the new trees are planted. Then that section gets left alone for like 20 years. And then when they come back around, that many years later, then they'll do the same process. And so what's happening is forests are being replenished in the United States and Canada at a faster rate than ever. There's more forests right now in North America than there were in the 50s and definitely way more than there were in the 30s. So this method actually works. And so in consuming these wood products, it's and it's one of our better resources internationally too. We had a $3.4 billion trade surplus with lumber exports in 2017. The trade war has totally decimated that, and I'm not going to get into that unless, drinks are involved. But I did actually have to go and talk to Congress about this last year. I was part of a group selected to do that. So that's a whole other kettle of fish. But basically, like a garden, forests need maintenance, and harvesting them is a part of that. Now, a quick note on carbon neutrality. Smaller trees, growing trees, consume more carbon dioxide and release more oxygen than mature trees. This slide, I found a really good illustration of this concept that I'm talking about, but this is not that. And I didn't want to pay for the one I found. So I drew one myself years ago quickly as a filler. And it's been several years. And not only have I not replaced this slide, but I'm actually now selling t-shirts of it on the website. So if you want to wear a t-shirt of this amazing artwork I drew myself, I failed art in 8th grade, by the way. So I don't know. I'm shocked too. I thought this was great. But what this illustrates is that younger trees, like most growing organisms, consume more resources, consume more carbon dioxide, and release more oxygen. They consume more food. And then older trees, these big old growth trees, they actually don't do a lot of carbon offsetting because that tree doesn't move that much. It doesn't grow that much. And then as the tree grows throughout its life, it absorbs this carbon dioxide, releases oxygen, and it stores the carbon dioxide. So when you harvest a tree and you mill it into furniture or flooring or whatever else you're doing, it's something that like it doesn't release that carbon in that state. How you release the carbon from the tree is to burn it. So forest fires are horrible for the environment. That's all of the CO2 that forest consumed and is sequestered over its lifetime is released like in a day. So maintaining forests are not the only thing that prevent forest fires. Like you can't do much about droughts, but it does help. So it's not something we should be afraid to do or afraid to touch. On the East Coast, we don't really have the forest fires issues. What kills the forests in the East are usually invasive species or like diseases and things like that. So it's important to maintain those forests too, so they don't suffer a fate due to those types of things. So wood is a really good building material if you're environmentally conscious, and it also lasts a long time and it looks great. So that out of the way, I'm going to talk about a brief history. Originally, Risa from Ivy was like, you don't need to talk about history. And I said, okay. And then I snuck this in anyway because I'm sticking it to the man. But I will just mention briefly, because if you're going to use it as an element of design, you should kind of know where it comes from. And then you can relate to the history and everything when you're designing your spaces. So prior to the 1900s, wood floors were really only enjoyed by royalty and like the super upper class, because one floor would take a craftsman years, plural, years to complete, right? I mean, you think your clients are impatient. So this painting is, I'm not even going to try to pronounce it because my French is as bad as my art skills, but it's hanging in the Musée d'Orsay. It is a very famous painting in the wood flooring industry, which means it's probably not that famous outside of the wood flooring industry. But this was how they used to refinish these floors. They didn't have like a oil modified polyurethane or aluminum oxide UV cured urethane. It was mostly wax, so it was easier to scrape. But when they refinished these floors, they literally had to scrape them by hand. And that's where you get that hand scrape look. That's what inspired that. So, and then wood floors with technology and most things became much more mainstream during World War II. And factory finished flooring, they could do what would take a craftsman years, they could now do in a factory. And it became much more prevalent during that time, mostly because they were building houses very quickly in the areas with the shipyards to house the shipyard workers to help with the war effort. So moving on to today, manufacturing technology has just made the market so much more diversified. I mean, there is just so much product out there, that different species and textures and structures and wood look products. And really what's happened is confusion just reigns in the flooring industry. And if you're a consumer or you're a designer, that puts you at a significant disadvantage. But if you're a flooring store, they've used that confusion to their advantage, not necessarily nefariously, but it's a byproduct of this. So now you have a lot of wood look products that they claim to be waterproof. They claim to be more durable. They said, well, I've got kids and I've got dogs, I have to go with vinyl. None of that is actually even true. It's not waterproof. It's not indestructible. It doesn't last as long. But that's kind of that confusion and what is or isn't even wood now reigns. And because of that, little inside story, there was a large flooring company, I will not mention any names publicly, but they created a product that was basically a laminate. It wasn't a wood floor. And they were calling it a wood floor because the surface area, which was a picture of wood with a coating on top, which is what a laminate is, the picture was printed on paper, which is a wood byproduct. So they were calling it wood. That's like putting a little bit of filet in whatever the mix is in hot dogs and calling that hot dog a filet. So that led to the National Wood Flooring Association having to actually define what a wood floor is, because you think like, it's a wood, it's floor made out of wood. Right, sort of. But what does that even mean, right? So I was in some of these meetings. I was part of the branding task force. I wasn't part of this committee, but some of my friends were. And it was amazing how much fighting there was over the definition of wood and what was included in that. So I will skip that whole story, but effectively the National Wood Flooring Association identifies a wood floor as wood. First, wood is the hard fibrous material that forms from the main substance of the trunk or branches and beneath the bark of the tree. That's important because cork is a bark. So cork floor is not a wood floor. It comes from a tree, but it's not a wood floor. Nothing wrong with cork. It has its own thing. You know, there's advantages and disadvantages to it. It's just not wood. So wood flooring then is any product that contains real wood as the topmost wearable surface of the floor. So continuing on, wood flooring may be broken down into 3 different categories. And we're gonna go into more detail of these with pictures and everything, so that you don't have to just like remember a definition. Solid wood flooring is a solid piece of wood from top to bottom. Engineered wood flooring is real wood from top to bottom, but normally made using multiple wood veneers or slats of wood glued together at opposing directions. Now that opposing directions thing is a little confusing. I'll tell you what it means. There's a specific reason for it when we get there. And then this is a new one, and this one was the most controversial. The composite engineered wood flooring contains real wood on the wearable surface only, the top layer. The backing and core material may be made up of different type of composite material. So I'll get into that a little bit too, because it was a little controversial for the old school people in the room. But in that vein, we'll go on to the main components of wood flooring. So that was talking about structure. We're going to do some species. We'll talk about the cut, because that's more important, again, than you might think. The grading, what to look for with a grade of flooring and where you can avoid some common traps. A little bit about width and some looks involving width and how to use that to your advantage. And then we'll talk about different types of finishes so that you will be able to incorporate all of this into your designs. So, as mentioned in the official definition, there are 3 main structures of hardwood flooring. We've got solid, we've got engineered, we've got composite engineered. All of them are considered real. So when they say wood flooring is the only type of flooring that actually boosts the real estate value of a home, all 3 of these affect that equally. So a solid isn't more valuable than an engineered because it's a solid versus an engineered. It might be better for other reasons, but not for that reason. So solid, what do I mean by that? This is what a lot of people mistakenly refer to as real hardwood, because it's the old school way to do it. It's one piece of wood from top to bottom. One of the advantages of a solid is that it can be sanded multiple times. It can be sanded down to where the tongue and groove is. If you can see, I don't know if I have a little mouse here, I'll point to it, but it can be sanded down to this point right here. So everything below that, you can't do anything with. If you sand down to that point, you got to throw it out. So because it's a solid, that whole piece will move together as one board. So it's more receptive to temperature and moisture fluctuations. So you have to be careful with solids. We don't recommend wide widths with a solid because it's going to move a lot, or it's going to bow, or it's going to crown, or it's going to cup. All these things that your clients are going to call and complain about. So we typically try to keep those a little more narrow because the movement is less noticeable in a narrower plank. So that leads to engineered wood flooring, which is several layers of wood bonded by an adhesive. And that adhesive actually is where you can get in trouble if you're worried about toxicity and environmental issues. So a lot of imported material you got to use a really strong glue in order for it to do what it needs to do. And this is where the formaldehyde comes in, is with any floor that has glue in it. A lot of formaldehyde makes an incredible glue. It's cheap and it holds it can hold anything together but a broken heart, basically. And so a lot of times they will use a higher formaldehyde glue because you can get a really strong hold for not a lot of money. The problem with formaldehyde is it's toxic and in high doses can be not good for you at all. So using a glue that is just as hard but doesn't have formaldehyde in it is a little more expensive. Most domestically manufactured products go that way because they want to stay under the California Air and Resource Board, or CARB, standards for what formaldehyde emissions need to be. Imported product can do that too, but there was a large flooring retailer, whom I also won't mention, got in a lot of trouble, and 60 Minutes did a whole thing about him. And you do not want to be on 60 Minutes for this reason, where all the documents were forged and the formaldehyde levels were testing 20 times above what they said it would. So that's where you have to be careful a little bit. If you're sourcing responsibly, then it's not an issue at all. In fact, a lot of the engineered floors on our site use a zero formaldehyde glue, none, not trace amounts, not under the standards, no, nothing. And we pay extra for that, but because, we care. So the nice thing then about engineered is it has a high stability and versatility, because wood wants to expand and contract along those growth rings. So what happens then with each layer? So the top layer wants to expand and contract, let's say horizontally. Well, the layer underneath that, they're going to set it up so it's expanding and contracting vertically. Well, not vertically, but just other horizontal, because we're working in 2 dimensions here. And then they'll go back and forth like the Vogue, back and forth all the way through. And so what happens then is it locks that board in place. So that gives you so much more stability and then some versatility. You can do these wider planks in engineered flooring because it's not going to move as much. Now, the downside is, depending on that top layer, you may not be able to sand it as many times. Now, sanding, and we'll get into that, is not as big a deal now with some floors as it used to be. And I'm going to talk about why when we get to site versus factory finished flooring. But you can get engineered flooring that have a real thick top layer and you can sand it multiple times. If it's textured, you're not going to want to. So it's kind of a waste of money. The other problem too with a really thick top layer, and this is something no flooring store ever tells anyone. I don't want to say ever because I don't know every single flooring store, but I'd never heard it from one, is that it actually reintroduces stability issues. If that top layer is too thick, then if it wants to, on a wide plank, wants to expand and contract, that engineered floor can actually pull itself apart. And I have seen that happen. And it is, the one I saw was a $30,000 claim. So that was unpleasant. So sometimes when, some of our floors will have a thinner wear layer, and that's for stability reasons, because we don't want to charge you extra for something that's less stable and that is designed to be sanded when you're not going to sand it, or you're not supposed to sand it. So that's something to keep in mind when you're saying like, well, my client doesn't want anything less than a 6 millimeter top layer. Well, maybe they do, right? It depends. Like anything else, it depends. So, but it's important to have that in mind. Then this last one is the controversial one. This is the composite engineered. So this is a picture of our Three Brothers collection. This core is made of high density wood fiber. So it's considered a composite engineer. That top layer though is still real wood. But you could see that core made up of a lot of different things. Right now, the stone composite core, or stone polymer composite cores, SPC, that you're seeing in a lot of like the click together vinyl flooring or the LVT type thing. They're starting to put real wood surfaces on top of that. That's considered real on top, and they call it WSPC for that obvious reasons. But the tech on that is still pretty early. I was in China last year. The Chinese government had flown me out there to meet with some of the manufacturers. They're interested in working with us. And we were talking to one of the factories that is making a wood with a stone composite core for a really large flooring company that, again, a different one that I've mentioned so far, but still not going to actually name them. But they said the first gen of that technology, it was splitting apart. It wasn't holding together. So the tech on that is still early, but it does have the potential with the right core to sort of hit that sweet spot of a real wood visual, but still perform like what everybody thinks the resilient flooring performs like. All right, time to go to biology class. Another class that was not kind to me in high school. My teacher was not kind to me in high school. I liked her. She didn't like me. I don't know. Maybe I talked too much. But we'll talk a little bit about the anatomy of the tree and how that affects the visual. And the biggest way that does that, two biggest ways, are the heartwood versus the sapwood. So heartwood is the middle of the tree, and the sapwood is the outer edge of the tree. So if you see on this, where's my little pointer? If you see on this, the dark side part of the tree, this is the maple tree, I think. And then the outside here is lighter. When you cut it, you might get both, depending on how it's cut. You might get boards that are dark. You might get boards that are light. You might get boards that are both. Those will get graded out depending on if you want more heartwood or sapwood, and depending on the species. Some have more than others. But when you see like hickory, where you see it's like a really light wood, but it has these really dark streaks to it, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing the heartwood and the sapwood. So now you know that word, and you'll sound really smart next time you talk to somebody about sapwood. Growth, trust me, kills at parties. Growth rings are, as a kid, you learn that you count the rings of the tree. That's a year in the tree's life. That's the grain of the wood. When you cut it out, you actually see the grain is the growth rings. And so you'll see in there, the really tight part, the ring itself, is the spring wood. And then basically the part in between each ring is the summer wood. And that's based on just how the tree grows. In the spring, the tree doesn't grow as fast. So it's whatever grew in that part was dense and more compact. And then in the summer, it grows faster. So you see the space in between each ring, and then spring comes around again. It starts again. That's why it's a ring. Okay, biology class over. All right, most common species. And again, I'm really only going to touch on domestic species because that's what's most popular right now. When you get into exotics, you can get into some just weird stuff, both from sourcing platforms to photoreactivity. There are some woods that are really hard and really pretty, but the dust from them is highly, highly toxic. Like you have to wear the Breaking Bad, full-blown respirator because I've known guys who've sanded it, didn't know what it was, and the dust got in their sweat pores and they had a bad reaction to it. So I'm just going to stick with the most common domestic species. We can get into exotics, but it depends on what you're looking for because there's a huge difference when you've got Jatoba and Kumaru and Acacia, and there's certain parts of the world and countries you shouldn't put some of them in, and it's just a mess. So we're going to just focus on the domestic species right now for the purpose of this conversation. Starting with red oak. Anyone who's seen any of my previous webinars, this is a little bit of review because I think it's important just to talk about it from a species standpoint. So I'm just going to go through this quickly. Red oak is like your North American standard. I'd say it's as American as apple pie and high fructose corn syrup. It has a very prominent grain pattern. You see that these, where's my little pointer? You see these, they call them cathedrals. These are like these big sort of arches. And that is when you think like wood grain, this is kind of what you're thinking of, is probably some form of oak. And then red oak, you can tell has a couple differences from its white oak cousin. Particularly, it has a little bit of a pink hue. And I don't know if that's coming through on your screen or not, but if you see red oak piece and a white oak piece next to each other, usually you can spot it. So it has a little bit of a pink hue. And then here's a fun fact. The red oak tree is the state tree of New Jersey and the provincial tree of Prince Edward Island, which I believe makes it the only thing those two places probably have in common. So white oak, this is super popular right now. Just white oak is just crazy popular, which has made it more expensive. It's similar to red oak in its hardness and its moisture fluctuation. So the color, though, is a little less pink and has a touch of gray to it. White oak grows all over the world. And so I want to say this is a really important point. So if you've tuned me out, tune me back in because this is important. The white oak that you see mostly from Europe technically doesn't come from Europe. So when you see European oak, it's white oak, but it's probably Chinese. Europe does export a lot of white oak, but not nowhere near the amount of white oak or European oak that's available. So a friend of mine who owns a luxury flooring mill up in, yes, luxury flooring mill is a thing, up in the Toronto area, did a whole study on this. And it's physically impossible for everything labeled French oak to be from France. So it's almost like European style oak, but they don't say European style oak. They say European oak. And then whenever you find that on a website, try and find a country of origin. You won't. So they're just, again, part of that confusion. They want you to think you're sourcing something from Europe when you're not. You're sourcing from something from China. And it's not that there's anything wrong with sourcing something from China, but it's misleading, right? So is it intentionally misleading? I don't know, but that's part of where the confusion in this industry has really worked to the designer and the homeowner's disadvantage. So one of the reasons why we're doing this. So just heads up, if you see something that says European oak or French oak, do not automatically assume it's coming from France. So, but white oak does grow all over the world. So that's funny when you go to Asia or places like that, when they have red oak, it's considered like a luxury item, which is funny because it's literally everywhere. I'm surrounded by it in this room right now. So fun wood fact, structurally, white oak actually has a more closed cellular structure than red oak, which makes it more water and breakage resistant. So now you think, oh, white oak is going to be better for flooring, but it actually doesn't make a single bit of difference in that setting because you're not exposing the red oak floor to enough moisture, and it has a coating over the top of it. Where it comes in handy is things like bourbon and whiskey and wine and anything you're going to put a liquid directly into the barrel so that or contact with the wood for a long period of time. It also, it's great for Japanese martial arts weapons, I guess, for the same reason. All right. If anybody has a need for those, I guess. Personally, I don't, but they're definitely cool. All right, some hard maple. There's a lot of different maples out there, and some are hard, some are not. There's silver maples, there's all kinds of maples, and they all are very different. But when people say maple, they're usually thinking of hard maple. So maple has a much more subtle grain pattern. Maple is, you see a little bit of the cathedrals, but it's not as prominent as if I go back to oak, right? So maple's good in a space where you want kind of a more uniform look, a little cleaner. So you don't have the wood grain kind of breaking that up. It's great in contemporary situations. It is harder than oak, but it tends to be a little more susceptible to moisture fluctuations. So we don't recommend wide plank or solid maples in some areas. But at least in a solid, engineered, again, you're fine. Hard maples are the source of maple syrup, and it's because it's so dense, it makes a great tone wood. So it makes a great set of drums. I can speak to that personally. I'm told it makes a nice violin, but as of today, no one in our office will play the violin or knows how to play the violin. So I'm just going to take that one based on Wikipedia. Okay, hickory, last one I'm going to talk about. Hickory is one of the hardest North American species, and people love it because of that heartwood and sapwood. This isn't always the best example, but you can see here's the heartwood, and then this piece over here has got the sapwood. But a lot of times it intermixes in a way and has a very cool, like rustic look. So people really like hickory for that reason. And again, it's hard, but it has a high susceptibility to moisture. We joke in the office that hickory is like a toddler. Like even if you have a good one, it still misbehaves. I can speak to that from experience. But due to its, again, fun wood fact, due to its strength, toughness, hardness, and stiffness, which are all different things, trust me. Hickory is the preferred wood for awesome things like drumsticks, and then like useless things like the spokes on wagon wheels, because it has a little bend to it. It's hard, but it doesn't just snap. So it's really good for that kind of thing. But as a flooring, you have to be careful if you're using a solid hickory where it's going and what it's going over, because wide plank solid hickory in a lake house, you're going to lose your dog in the winter. It's just going to have these giant gaps in it, or it's going to curve up like a skateboard ramp or that kind of thing. So engineered, though, again, you're okay as long as the top layer isn't too thick. Okay, grading. This is interesting. This is one where designers and consumers both really can get in trouble. So grading talks about the amount of character that you can expect in the wood, which is like the knots, streaks. Pith is like when you have these big open cracks in some floors. That's what pith is, but that's probably never going to come up again. That kind of thing is all considered part of the character. So grading on unfinished flooring. So you buy the wood, it's unfinished, it needs to be installed and site finished, which we'll talk more about in a few minutes, follows the NOFMA standard. So the NOFMA stands for National Oak Flooring Manufacturers Association. It used to be its own organization. Now it is an arm of the National Wood Flooring Association. So anyone who cares about flooring trade, industry, politics, NOFMA is part of the NWFA, but still operates under the NOFMA name. So some NOFMA grades that you'll hear is number 1 common, number 2 common, select, and better and clear. These all have standards. So if you get a number 1 common from a mill in Tennessee and a number 1 common red oak from a mill in Pennsylvania, they should grading wise be really close, if not the same. Same with any other NOFMA grade. Great, right? Cool. But on factory finish floors, there is no standard. So it is sort of like paint colors, right? So this person's saddle brown is not going to be the same as that person's saddle brown. This person's saddle brown looks more like that person's Serengeti sunset. So that's kind of how grading is in this. So this company's cottage grade may not be this company's cottage grade. This company may not even have a cottage grade. This company's builder grade looks like this company's cottage grade. So it all depends on the mill when you're talking about factory finish flooring. So don't make the mistake of, oh yeah, we're looking for cottage grade, pre-finished in a saddle color, because both the colors and the grades are going to be specific to that mill. So keep that in mind when you're sourcing that. So they set their own terms and definition. They do not necessarily follow NOFMA standards with pre-finished flooring. Okay, let's talk about cut. This is really important because trees are cylinders. You got to turn that cylinder into a rectangle. How do you do it? So there are 4 basic cuts, and they all have huge impacts on performance and visual. So when you hear somebody say, oh yeah, we're looking for a rift and quartered, white oak, select grade, whatever, that all means something. And I'm going to show you the difference right now. Get excited. Okay, so the first up is your most traditional cut. This is called plain sawn, and it is very plain and very sawn. This is like your classic wood grain. So you can see down here, you've got your cathedrals. This is, they basically cut the board, they flip it, they cut it, they flip it, they cut it. You get a pretty good yield, and you get every sort of board coming out of there is going to have a similar look to the grain. That's why they do it that way. So if you're doing like a plain sawn floor, you want to get as many plain sawn looking boards out of that tree as you can. That's how they do it. And so the movement in a plain sawn board is, and this is what this demonstrates down here, this arrow. I don't know where my video is, by the way. So if it's blocking any of this, I'll just describe it in vivid and exciting detail. Plain sawn boards are going to move horizontal. And so when it shrinks in the winter, it's going to move this way, move this way. You all know what horizontal means. So that moves to the next one, which is quarter sawn. Quarter sawn is like you cut the woods you will cut the log into quarters. And so the part that's closest to the center, these boards here, are the quarter sawn. And so what that looks like now, the grain goes from having those cathedrals to a very straight grain. So that, again, changes the visual entirely. Someone says, I don't like, they might not like these cathedrals. So you go with a quarter sawn and you're going to get the straight grain. You get a lot of what's called fleck, and that's what these little spots are. So straight grain with a lot of fleck, that's quarter sawn. Rarely will you see somebody request just quarter sawn. Usually goes with rift and quartered, and we're going to go to rift next. But the movement in a quarter sawn is vertical. So when a quarter sawn solid floor expands and contracts, it goes up and down. So that's actually kind of nice, because if you have something where it's a high moisture fluctuation situation, you still want a solid, you can go with a rift and quartered or rift only or quartered only, and you won't get the same kinds of gaps. The downside with this is it's more expensive, because when you cut a tree this way, it's a pretty low yield. So that leads it to its brother, rift sawn, which is the same idea as the quarter sawn, but it's the part that's closest to the outer part of the tree. So that's an extremely low yield, and it looks a lot like the quarter sawn, but you don't have the fleck. So typically what people will look for is they'll combine them, rift and quartered. So some boards, it'll all be the straight grain, it'll all move vertically, but some will have fleck and some won't. So that's when you hear rift and quartered, that's what they're talking about. So the last one, and this is relatively maybe a little newer, is live sawn. And that is where they just like this, just go straight down the board, chop, 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 chop. So this way you get the whole log. So a piece of live sawn, you get straight grain and you get the cathedrals, you get everything. So it's typically only available in character grade, because when you cut the whole tree like this, you're going to just get more knots. And it's really hard to sort out live sawn for any kind of cleaner grade because you're getting the whole tree. So the other thing too is that it's also more common and engineered because it's going to move in multiple directions. So you want to go engineered with a live sawn so it doesn't get all wavy and bow and contort on you the way it would with a solid. So it's a really cool look, but you got to be careful when you're going for live sawn. Just make sure you got your ducks in a row, which again we'll help you with. So a couple things on width. I'm going to blow through these. This is more like slang terms. A lot of people don't even use most of these anymore, but strip flooring is anything less than 3 inches. So if somebody says looking for strip, that's what they mean. Plank is 3 inches and wider. And then parquet is like geometric shapes. That's what you're seeing right here is these types of shapes. These are little squares, and they can be triangles, I don't know, whatever stupid thing some guy felt like making. And then quick thing too on layout. So this is a herringbone and this is a chevron. And if you're not sure what the difference is, a chevron is actually the boards are cut at a 45-degree angle, and the herringbones, they're not. They're sort of interspersed. They're interlocked almost. But when you are sourcing something in a herringbone or a chevron, it's really expensive and it's difficult because either one, if you're cutting it at the 45 or you're not, every single one of these boards has to be the same length. So keep that in mind. You have to it basically has to be made special as a herringbone. So you need to know what the width is going to be. You need to know how long. Is it 2 feet? Is it 3 feet? And then what you're going to need for that. The install requires quite a bit more technical know-how and more craftsmanship, but it's one of those things. Some people like it. I think they're kind of busy, but some people think they're cool. But it's important to know the difference. So somebody says, oh, I want a herringbone and they really want a chevron. They are different. And it's important to know that. And then if you have something that's just like a normal random length flooring, like what's sold in America, to convert that into a chevron or a herringbone means the installer has to cut this, which means everything has to be the same length, which means there's an enormous amount of waste. It's expensive and it's difficult. So keep that in mind, but that's what it is. So if you order it like a herringbone or a chevron, then cool, good for you. So using some width to your advantage. Narrower planks, typically great for smaller spaces and better for solids because the movement's going to be less noticeable. Wider planks look wonderful in an open concept, big, long runs, big, wide open spaces. And then the gapping though for a wider plank is going to be much more noticeable unless you're using an engineered floor. Okay, I got about 5 minutes left and I'm going to blow through some finish methods because everyone talks about sandability in floors. Let's talk about that for a second. Site finish flooring. Site finish flooring is not a creative name, finished on site. So the benefit of site finish flooring, there's two really. You get a high customization of the color and sheen. You can have whatever finish you want put on there. You can have them mix stains together and create a custom color for only that job. That's pretty cool if that's important to you. And then the other advantage is the floor is perfectly flat because it's installed and then you have to sand it completely flat on site. So any movement in the subfloor, any overwood or underwood from the manufacturing process, all that gets sanded out on site perfectly. Let's talk about downsides because there's some significant ones. The first is it's way more expensive and it's a lot more time consuming. So for you business-minded professionals out there, keep this in mind. You have to say, after that floor is installed, you have to sand it 3 times, according to the National Wood Flooring Association standards, which I'm actually certified to teach. You have to sand it 3 times. Then you have to put either stain or sealer on there. And then you have to add 2 or 3 more coats of finish. In between each coat of finish, you have to let it dry. Then you have to buff it again. Then you have to coat it. During that time it's drying, you cannot walk on the floor. You can't do anything. So if you basically add a week to your project time, that's another week that you have to hold out until you're getting paid, till the project's done, till the furniture's moved in. And then even when it's dry and you can walk on it, some of these finishes take 30 days to cure. So they don't recommend moving the furniture back in some cases up to a month. Nobody ever follows that, but if it gets scratched, they're not going to warranty it. Site finish flooring in general is not as durable, which is why when you think, oh, I need to be able to sand this 100 times. Not really. Yes, if it's a site finish floor, you probably are going to have to sand it because it's a flat texture. So it's going to show a lot more. And the finishes in site floors just chemically are not as durable because they have to cross-link with oxygen. You can't have perfect condition UV cured finishes applied that way because they have to be able to dry in multiple conditions and things like that. So keep that in mind, especially from a business standpoint. Like you're adding a lot of time to this project. And then the other thing too, if you have anyone that your client is has any chemical sensitivities, this is where your chemicals are being introduced into this space because now you've got an isocyanate or azuridine cross-linked polyurethane that is off-gassing as it's curing. That is in some finishes, some are okay, some are better than others. I've had some though where people have lost pets because the flooring installer contractor didn't know there was a cat upstairs and they were using a certain type of acid cured Swedish finish that I won't mention their name either. But it's bad. So keep that in mind too, that, yeah, it's going to be flat. Yeah, you can pick your color. Yeah, some cases it's the way to go, but they're not even. So in that case, I'm just going to touch on factory finish, kind of the opposite of that. The factory finishes go down this really long line where they're sanded and coated sort of in place. They're UV cured on the spot. So they're done. The second they come off that line, it is not only dried, it's cured. So there's no off-gassing, there's no finish. And even if the finish was toxic when they applied it, which most of them aren't, there's no off-gassing anyway because it's cured. So it's much safer for the homeowner. No chemicals get introduced to the home through the finish. And you also have more texture options. You can do wire brushing, you can do hand scraping, you can do a lot of stuff that you're not going to be able to do on site unless you pay those guys in that painting to come and scrape your floor. But it's also going to be, as I mentioned, faster and more cost-effective because once that factory finish floor is installed, you're done. Get the furniture on there, get the homeowners in there, get everyone in, get paid. That's the goal. One of the downsides, though, is you are going to get micro bevels because you're not sanding off any overwood. You can't get manufacturing tolerances for a plant-based object like wood to be perfectly flat in a factory. It's just that something's going to move, moisture is going to be introduced. It's going to move a little bit. Like it's almost impossible. So what they do is they put a little bevel in between the floors so that you don't catch your socks on it, basically. Most people don't mind them. Some people can't stand them, and it's worth all of the other downsides to site finish, like continually having to refinish them and that kind of thing. Factory finished floors do also need to be refinished, but a quick note on that, when we get to durability, you can source them in a way that they don't ever have to be, depending on what you get. So some key sourcing elements, just briefly: climate, subfloor, lifestyle. Climate, each species is going to react differently depending on the climate, right? Moisture fluctuation just changes. This visual is a map of the Köppen-Geiger climate rating for the entire United States. This is what we take into play, for example, for our algorithm. When we ask you for your zip code, we cross-reference it with this map, so we know exactly what the climate is you're sourcing for. Subfloor, not hard to figure out. You usually can just ask, is it going to be on or below grade, which is code for ground, if anyone didn't know that. The material, is it concrete or wood? And by wood, I mean it could be like an old school wood subfloor, or plywood or OSB count as wood, because that can change what is allowed to be put over that. For example, we don't usually recommend solids over concrete. And then other factors like in-floor heating and stuff that could affect the warranty. You want to know that. And we ask those questions. And then the last bit I'm going to touch on before getting to color and being done is lifestyle and durability. So everybody looks at this. There's a huge misnomer out there that they look at the Jenga hardness of a floor. And I can talk about Jenga hardness, but it's a little technical and I don't have time. But they say, oh, I have a dog and kids. So I want the hardest thing possible. Hardness is okay, but it's not the most important factor. So really what's most important is if you have some texture to it, because you're going to dent and wear literally anything. It's a floor. It's not a piano. You live on this thing. All things end up on the floor because gravity, right? Thanks, Newton. So you're going to dent. It's going to wear. If you get something that just as it wears, it looks better and tells the story of that client and their family. And just you don't have to, if it wears and looks better as it wears, you don't really need to worry about refinishing it. Maybe you need to touch something up. Maybe if something gets too damaged, you can replace a board. But it really makes life so much easier because you're not moving out of the house for a week while some guy applies chemicals to your floor. The other thing too is character. More character, the more busy it is, the more it's going to hide the dents and scratches and that kind of thing. And then sheen also. A lower sheen is going to show less than a higher sheen because of light reflectivity. And then the last thing is hardness. And so what I mean by that is you can have a species that's really, really hard, but if it's a flat texture with a high sheen, it's going to show so much more than a really soft wood that's been hand scraped and a low sheen. So keep that in mind too, that there are lots of things for durability, lots of options. Last little thing, just going to touch on color. The most important thing with color in my experience has been lighting. If you've got a room that does not have a lot of great natural lighting or good artificial lighting, you use a dark floor, it's going to look like a cave. And I probably don't have to tell you this. Most of you probably went to design school and know this already, but it's definitely true. And then the next thing too with color is context. There's a lot of stuff now with AR apps and VR apps where you can sort of like imagine this floor in your space, but it's not going to be accurate because the color of your walls affects the color. The time of day can affect the color. What's around it can affect the color. There's so much context. So keep that in mind. And then the last one is lifestyle. And what I mean by that is like, do dark floors show more? And the answer is, yeah, they can. They absolutely can, actually. But if you get a dark floor that, again, has this floor actually in this picture is an oil finish and it's hand scraped and it's extremely durable, even though it's dark. So it is possible if you don't have something that's black and shiny that, it won't show as much. So you don't have to be afraid of dark floors if you have the right other factors, in place for your design. So that's the basic gist of it. Now I will take any questions, and I'm going to throw it back to Tara if she wants to come back on here.
Perfect. Well, John, thank you so much for your time and sharing your wealth of knowledge on wood. This information is extremely valuable for home professionals to have in their back pocket, equipping all of us with the right facts and questions we need to properly approach vendors when sourcing hardwood flooring. So let's take a few minutes now to address some of your questions. And if you haven't already submitted a question, you still have time to do so. The button that says ask a question below the get free demo button, you can submit it there and we will address. So to start, Callie had a question circling back to the very beginning of your presentation, John, when you were talking about the amount of carbon that trees emit. Callie wanted to understand small trees. You want to leave them because they absorb carbon, or what were you saying exactly about small trees?
Great. Hi, Callie. Great question. So trees that are growing, like any living thing, is going to consume more resources. So trees breathe in, absorb carbon, and release oxygen. So younger trees, I guess I said smaller. Really, I guess what I meant was younger. So like a bonsai tree isn't going to be the same as an oak tree. But the younger the tree is, as the tree is growing, it consumes more carbon dioxide and then releases more oxygen. So an older tree, it's stored a lot of carbon throughout its life, but it's not growing as much anymore. So that's kind of what I meant by that. Does that clear that up?
Yes.
So usually they leave the younger trees alone. And honestly, younger trees are smaller and not just from a pure dollar standpoint, right? There's no monetary value in them because you're not going to get as much yield out of a smaller tree. So it's just beneficial for everybody to leave them alone. It's beneficial for the earth. It's beneficial for the guys doing the logging. It's beneficial for the companies. Just leave them alone. Let the forest grow. Let it do its thing. Leave a home for the animals that are still there. All those things.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying. And great question, Callie. Macy wanted to understand what exactly is the grading standard.
The grading standard. So again, for pre-finished flooring. Hi, Macy, by the way. Thank you for coming. The grading standard for pre-finished flooring, there isn't one. So you have to get an example. That's why the sampling is so important. Like on our site, you're never going to get a sample that's going to show everything. So all of our pictures are at least 40 square feet. In some cases, 50 or 60 square feet. So you can see when we say this is a character grade, this is what we mean. You really have to know that based on the manufacturer. For unfinished flooring, like if you're just buying red oak and some guy's going to come in and sand and finish it, that is the NOFMA standard. So those standards are available if you want to see what number 1 common, number 2 common. I didn't go into too much detail on what those were specifically, but there are people that have to be like NOFMA trained to be able to identify what number 1 common means and what select and better means and that kind of thing. So they're just different. With pre-finish, you really just have to get an example of what do they mean when they say Canadian plus? What does that mean? That's not a real thing, right? So this company made it up. So you need to know what they mean by that. And sometimes it'll cross over to NOFMA grades, but not always. So it is literally a case-by-case basis in that case.
Okay, great. Thank you. Great question. Next, Shelly wants to know, if we source wood from the US, is it automatically FSC or sustainable, or do we still need to check for that label? And Shelly also says, thank you for this super webinar.
Well, thank you, Shelly. And thank you for the good question. So you just opened Pandora's box. Congratulations. Free t-shirt with my cartoon coming to you once I have them made someday. FSC is a separate entity. So just because it's sourced in the United States does not automatically get FSC certified. FSC is an independent organization. So FSC, you have to pay a lot of money to be in FSC. And in a lot of cases, I have my own thoughts about FSC. I get why it exists, and I think what they're trying to do is really good. But you can get like our stuff, for example, isn't FSC certified. That was more for financial and political reasons than it was because we didn't want better source stuff. Like we have the skill set to do what FSC does, but maybe even better because we're on a smaller operation and we just have that experience. That's not true for everybody. Like FSC is a really good kind of shortcut for a lot of people, but it is a separate thing. And so FSC, there's a lot of rules with chain of custody. I'll give you an example. We do have some of our suppliers are FSC certified, and that's wonderful. We love them for it. But it has to be on like an FSC certified truck, and it has to go to FSC certified warehouses. And then if you're FSC in your warehouse, the section has to be quarantined, and there has to be like lines drawn. And if any of the wood sticks out a little bit over that line, it loses its FSC luster. We had a case where we drop shipped something from a supplier, and that was an FSC supplier going to an FSC certified job using FSC trucks. But because we facilitated the sale, FSC was stripped off of it. So it wasn't FSC anymore. So it's one of those things that like in theory, it's wonderful, but in practice, it gets a little sweaty, if you know what I mean. So no, just because it's sourced in the United States does not mean it's FSC. FSC, and now you're starting to see other competing organizations like Floor Score and things like that are trying to compete with FSC. So now we've got a billion different certifications. Your best bet is to just find a sourcing partner that you trust.
Okay, great, thank you. We have a whole bunch of questions, so I'm just going to blow right
sorry,
through
and I'm giving you like in-depth professorial
No, this
answers.
is really great. This is so interesting, and everyone can agree with me on that. Katie has a great question. Going back to the grade of flooring, what are the key standard grades to specify for site finished floors from a design standpoint that most affect the aesthetic qualities of the wood?
All right, I'll handle this one. I'll do this one quickly. So number 2 common is a really rustic grade. So it depends on what you're looking for. So if you want something really clean, standard is going to be select and better, which means the select in there is the worst it's going to be. And then it'll go up from there. You might get some better. And then like clear grade is like the pristine, like there isn't a single knot. I don't understand clear grade because to me, it doesn't look like you want, this is my personal preference. You want wood, you want something that looks like wood, right? The knots and that's what makes it unique. And so it depends on your design though, because you might be doing something where you want this sort of sterile, pristine look, but you still want it to be wood. So that's, I would say in that case though, the most common are going to be number 1 common and select and better. That's where it's sold in most places. And so number 1 common has a little bit of character to it. Select and better, less character, but still a little bit of a cleaner grade. But honestly, it's preference. I can't tell you what's better for design in that way.
Okay, great. A few more questions. Amber, excellent question. John, Amber wants to know, when trying to match an existing floor during a remodel, do you have any tips or resources for doing that visually and accurately on site other than having an awesome flooring guy?
Yeah, that is a tough one. And I feel for you because I wish there was like an easy, like, oh, you just buy this magic pen and everything works. It depends on what it is. Typically, short of installing something unfinished and sanding the whole thing and refinishing it, it's really hard to do. So if you want the short answer, you could find something maybe that's close. You bring it to a professional that you're working with. We do this with clients. I've had them send me pictures. I've had them send me some samples. And then we said, hey, this is really close. Is this close enough? It's never going to match exactly though. So it's almost better to find something that complements versus trying to match. Even if you sand and refinish the whole thing one color, the wood itself, right? Now you've got wood that's been down for several years. It's aged. It's been exposed to sunlight. You put new red, even if it's the same species, same grade, same everything, even with the same stain on there, it's going to take it differently because the wood is different. So I'm not going to say never, but it's extraordinarily rare and difficult to ever get something that matches perfectly. So it's important to set those expectations accordingly. Sometimes it's better to just rip out the existing and then put one thing all the way through. I'm not saying that because that's better for me as the guy selling the wood, but it is better for me. So we'll just be honest about that. But it is definitely going to match at that point. So I would go for something that complements it. It looks like you're trying too hard. Like when you're wearing your blacks and your blacks don't match. Still black, but it's like your blacks don't match. Your pants are really shiny. Why are your pants so shiny?
Okay, thank you. Shanna has a great question.
Okay.
Do products with formaldehyde glue continue to off-put dangerous fumes throughout the life of the product? What do I look for to ensure the product is chemical free?
Oh, Shannon, that is a great question. No, short answer. So here's what is more insidious about vinyl flooring versus wood flooring in this case. So formaldehyde off gases for 1 to 2 years, maybe 3 years at the most. So if you got a floor that you bought from said retailer that was part of their recall or whatever, and it's 10 years old, it is not still off gassing formaldehyde. Like you're okay at that point. During those 3 years when it was off gassing, you were exposed to some stuff that the EPA would probably shut your house down for, but it's not doing that anymore. On the vinyl side, this was one of the things I was talking to a professor at Duke University. They did a whole study on some of the older vinyl, like the VCT stuff. The vinyl manufacturers aren't using it anymore, but they were using benzyl butyl phthalate. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Again, chemistry was not kind to me either. But BBP. And that actually causes, like in children, that causes speech development delays, that causes obesity. But BBP off gases for like a generation. So if you've got an old vinyl floor in a space, that actually could still be toxic even years later. So now they've replaced, in defense of anybody out there who's watching from the vinyl industry, because they get really nasty when you say things about them. They reamed out this professor actually, but I asked her, like, they're using DHT now, which is like dihexyl. I'm not going to bother. I asked her, like, is that safe? Is anybody, what is the effects of that as the plasticizer? And she said, we don't know. Hasn't been studied. So it's not BBP, so that's good. But the most of the stuff going in today, no idea. Could be fine. No idea. So if you roll the dice if you feel like it.
Okay, thank you. And we're going to leave time for one last question. Sorry, we can't get to everyone's questions. If you have more questions for John, you can visit his website, revelwoods.com, and contact him there. But we'll answer one more question, Jennifer. She has a client dilemma. This is actually an interesting question.
Great.
John, in your opinion, how can we help out Jennifer? So Jennifer recently installed engineered hardwood floors in a client's home in a high desert area, specifically Utah, and they squeak. What do you recommend can be done? The client has already added humidifiers to their home, and so far there's no difference.
Okay, so that's tough because squeaky floors is definitely something people complain about. And I'll say, before I jump into this, if anyone is interested, wants to talk, sign up for one of our pro accounts. It's an application process, but we don't ask anything too hard. It just mostly keeps your clients out of there. But we'll typically, for every pro account, we keep them limited because we want to be sure we can provide this level of service to everybody. But I tend to try to reach out to as many of our pros as possible, set up calls with them, learn about your business, how we can help, answer any other questions you have. So having said that, squeaky floors could be a million different things. Believe it or not, the biggest cause of squeaky floors is actually the subfloor. It's not the wood flooring. So even if you had carpet over it, it was going to squeak. I don't know that. I don't know your client's situation. So let me just preface that by saying, like, don't just run out and do what I'm saying. There are products though you can get. One of them is called like Squeak No More, and it's squeak with like literally 5 E's. I don't know why we have so many E's. I guess he just had some extras. But Squeak No More, like you can drill the thing in and it sort of bolts it down because this movement is what's causing that squeak. But it may not actually be the wood. It may not be the engineered floor. You could have put a solid there. If it's the subfloor, it could have been the carpet. You got to be able to access it. Sometimes too, I've seen this in clients' homes where they have a finished basement and you can't get to the subfloor. I don't know that situation, but it is very common. It's not always the wood floor itself though that's causing it.
Okay. That's so then a follow up to that question, Jennifer wants to know then what underlayment do you think works best with hardwood flooring to assist in muffling noise? So you're saying this squeak, SQEEK? No more?
That's not an underlayment. It's like a big screw. It just basically holds the wood in place, and then it stops it from moving because the movement is what's causing the sound. Underlayment depends on the job. There is we offer, if you are floating a floor as an install method, if you're buying from us, we have an underlayment it's actually called Quiet Walk, and it's for that specific purpose. It's more of a sound barrier from like you've got someone in different levels or different multifamily home and you don't want people hearing that way, but it might help with squeaking. I don't actually know for that purpose, but there's the right underlayment actually is super important for the install. Your installer would know that, but we can provide virtually any type of underlayment for any application you're looking for.
Okay. Well, this was really helpful, John. Thank you again for your time and your generosity with all of this information. And thank you to everyone who tuned in today. And if you want to connect with Revel Woods, I dropped the Revel Woods website here in the live chat, and you can sign up for a pro account. And if you'd like some more information about Ivy's business management tool and resource for home professionals, you can click the Get Free Ivy Demo button here, and we can schedule a call. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.